The Toronto Association for Peace and Solidarity, or TAPS, strives to agitate, educate, and organize from an anti-imperialist perspective in the GTA for a world without war and oppression, as well as to cooperate and build solidarity with other organizations who share our goals. TAPS is the Toronto branch of the Canadian Peace Congress, which coordinates and unites peace councils in major cities across the country. We say resolutely, Canada needs a foreign policy based on peace, solidarity, disarmament, not war and aggression. As a necessary first step to this peace alternative, we aim to get Canada out of NATO, NORAD, and the Five Eyes spy network. In the last year, TAPS has organized monthly actions in the spirit of solidarity with progressive movements across the GTA, as well as outreach in our communities during both the federal and provincial elections to ensure that peace was on the ballot. A TAPS member spoke at the United Jewish People's Order Anti-Fascist Third Seder event, and we held a very successful event earlier this year hosting the Executive Secretary of the World Peace Council, Iraklis Savvaidis, to discuss the global state of the peace movement in the age of Trump. In Canada, military spending is set to skyrocket, with the Carney government and all major political parties bending over backwards to capitulate to NATO's arbitrary demands that member states commit 5% of our national GDP to the military. The People's Hearings on Military Spending asks a very simple question. What could we do with a bigger piece of the pie? Working people in this country are facing a myriad of crises, from housing, cost of living, environmental destruction, to a failing healthcare system, and our leaders' solutions, widespread austerity, and buying weapons from the United States. Canada's NATO commitment chains our country to an aggressive, militaristic alliance dominated by the US and makes it virtually impossible to deviate from foreign policy decisions made in Washington, D.C. These crises at home will continue to widen while the country pivots to a war economy. We've attempted to bring together a representative group of labor, peace, social justice, and community organizations to deliver a series of deputations explaining what their constituency could do with a bigger piece of the pie. Our presenters today include the ODSP Action Coalition, the Canadian Federation of Students, Voice of Women, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the Toronto and York Region Labour Council, York Southwestern Tenants Union, TTC Riders, and the Ontario Healthcare Coalition. Thank you again to our speakers for your time and upcoming presentations. To sum up, peace is everybody's business. A sentiment I hope will be abundantly clear after the hearings, if it's not clear already from the broad swath of society represented by our presenters. I encourage you to visit the tables of the participating organizations who have literature and more information on how you can get involved. Due to real constraints of the date and time we have this space, there are a number of groups and movements who have a lot to say but who are not here presenting today. We're committed to engaging other groups through written submissions, which will be open until mid-October. If you have any questions about making a submission, please visit the TAPS table right at the back. We call on people of conscience here today to join TAPS in endorsing and attending the International Day of Action in support of Palestine on Saturday, October 4th at 2 p.m. Yonge and Dundas Square, renamed St. Coffa Square. The Toronto Association for Peace and Solidarity has always stood in solidarity with the Palestinian people in their struggle for national liberation, and especially now in the face of Israel's genocide in Gaza, which has the direct support of the Canadian state. Now, first of all, I'd like to welcome the ODSP Action Coalition to the stage. ODSP Action Coalition is a provincial, volunteer grassroots advocacy group led by people with disabilities on ODSP, with a network of valued allies that advocates for improvements to the income and other supports available to people with disabilities. Ron is the co-chair of the ODSP Action Coalition, as well as co-chair of the Raise the Right Coalition. A warm welcome to Ron, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. As I was introduced, I'm a co-chair of the ODSP Action Coalition. And we are a provincial organization, so we don't do a lot of advocacy at the federal level, but we did recently strongly advocate for the Canada Disability Benefit, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. I'm also In addition to the coalitions that I'm involved in that Jared mentioned, there's some work I also do with the Encampment Justice Coalition and the End Austerity Campaign, which is a collection of disability groups. Also, I'm working with a bunch of groups, including Justice for Workers and North York Harvest Food Bank, and we're organizing a rally that I wanted to tell you about. It's happening at Queen's Park on October the 23rd at noon. I'll probably remind you about that before I finish up here. I'm here today because I believe in a different kind of Canada, one where we take care of each other, where no one is left behind, and where we use our shared resources to lift people up rather than to fund endless militarization and corporate welfare. The federal government's current plan reveals a profound moral imbalance in our priorities. While the government plans to spend $150 billion annually on the military, it's allocated less than $1.5 billion per year for the new Canada Disability Benefit. That means for every dollar that's going to support disabled Canadians living in poverty, more than $100 is going to be going to the military. And this is not the kind of country that any of us want. After I wrote this, it occurred to me that there might be people here who don't know much about the Canada Disability Benefit, so I wanted to take a minute to tell you about that. The federal government announced, I guess 4 or 5 years ago now, that they were going to have a benefit that was going to lift the 1.5 million disabled Canadians who are living in poverty out of it. So they spent years basically getting all their political mileage out of it. And when the benefit was finally revealed, it turned out, also they made a big show about saying they were listening to disabled communities and what they had to say. There were hearings at the House of Commons and at the Senate. And at the end of every step of the way, you'd hear the politicians saying, "Nothing about us without us," as if they were actually listening to what we said. It turned out that when the actual benefit was announced, it was very disappointing. The government says it's going to lift 25,000 Canadians out of poverty. We've all been scratching our heads for quite a long time, trying to figure out who those 25,000 people might be. We believe that it's not going to lift a single disabled Canadian out of poverty. It's $200 a month on top of, poverty level provincial social assistance. But I'm not going to talk about that too much. They say that military spending is about security, but what could be more fundamental to our security than ensuring our disabled neighbors can afford food and rent, guaranteeing health care and dignified care for our elders, and providing good, stable public sector jobs that deliver the services that we all rely on. Real security isn't about how many fighter jets we have. It's about whether parents can afford to feed their children and whether seniors can afford their medications and whether young people can even see a future in this country. I also want to just add quickly that anyone who thinks that massive amounts of military spending means you are victorious, you got to learn about Vietnam. Just throwing that out there. It's pretty obviously not true. But right now, while military budgets balloon, public sector workers are threatened with being laid off, which weaken the services we all depend on. Nonprofit organizations that help the most vulnerable are stretched to the breaking point. Climate action remains woefully underfunded despite growing climate emergencies. These aren't separate issues. They're all symptoms of a government that's lost sight of what truly matters in a healthy society. There's a better way forward, one that's rooted in democratic socialism's core values of compassion, equality, and shared responsibility. So you reallocate military funding to fund disability supports, healthcare, affordable housing, invest in a green future that creates good jobs while fighting climate change, strengthen public services by valuing the workers who deliver them, build an economy that works for everyone through progressive taxation and social programs. This isn't radical. This is simply recognizing that we're all in this together. and that when we lift up the most vulnerable among us, we all rise. We know this is possible because we've seen glimpses of it before, right? The universal health care, public education, and old age security, they were all hard-won victories that made Canada a better and fairer place. But now we have to take the next step. We need a country where no one has to choose between food and medicine, no veteran sleeps on the streets after serving our country, and no parent lies awake wondering how they'll afford their child's education. This is a Canada worth fighting for, not one that scares the world with its military might, but one that inspires with its compassion and justice. Change will not come from Ottawa unless we demand it. So I'm going to make a few suggestions. One is that we talk to our friends and neighbors about how misplaced our government's priorities are, support organizations fighting for disability rights and social justice, hold our elected officials accountable for building a Canada that cares about its people first. And I'm just going to add a number 4 is maybe think about going to our rally on October 23rd. Really help. Together we can shift our nation's course from fear to hope, from militarization to compassion, from isolation to community, because in the end, as I've said already, the measure of our society isn't in its weapons, but how it treats its most vulnerable members. Thank you.
The York Southwestern Tenant Union, formally established in February 2020, is a tenants union in Northwest Toronto. They organize, educate, fight for, and advocate for tenants in their community and beyond. The tenant union is composed of 13 tenant associations that represent high-rise, working-class buildings and represents 2,000 tenants in their community. Their mission is threefold: organizing and advocating for tenant rights and the right to housing in their community, sharing information and resources about tenant rights to help reduce rent increases and get necessary repairs done, and expanding the tenant movement to tenant collectives across the city, province, and country. Bruno is a tenant in Northwest Toronto and a member of the York Southwestern Tenant Union. He's been involved in tenants fights across the city, including supporting the organizing of Toronto's largest rent strike in 2023. A round of applause quickly for Bruno.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation to be part of these hearings, and to put in a bit of the perspective from the tenant movement. We represent a neighborhood organization, but we've been organizing tenants actually across the city, across the province. So I think a lot of the perspectives that I'm going to bring are shared by tenants across the country, I would say. I want to give also a shout out to my friend, Teresa Henry, who's here as well with me. She went on a 16-month rent strike together with 200 of her neighbors, fighting a lot of the same actors that are now asking the government to put more money into the military when they could put a lot more money into the people. So just to reinforce who we are. So we are an organization that started about 6 years ago in a corner of Toronto that has had a long history of fighting for justice. And we started basically because a lot of the needs in the community were related to people's housing, where people live, to keeping a roof over their heads. And we also realized that many of the people who had, maybe they even had a union in their job, maybe they had good jobs, but also people who were on social assistance, on ODSP, on OW, or who were on a pension, were really struggling to keep a roof over their head. And while many of the other fights happen outside of your home, this was a fight that was really about keeping a roof over your head, and it was essential for us to start organizing, to start defending each other, and to start supporting each other in that context. It's a community of mostly people of color, working class. Is the communities that are now very impacted as well by this tariff war. Is the people that are losing the jobs in the factories because they get laid off or they get furloughed until Donald Trump and Carney agree on something. And it's a community that it's also affected by a lot of the lack of funding that Ron just highlighted, but I'm sure many of you will highlight as well in different areas, by lack of funding in our public services, lack of funding in our social assistance, lack of funding in housing. When we hear about a government that wants to spend 150 billion a year in military, we know it's not just about building our military to go abroad. We know it's also about inward facing. It's reinforcing the systems of repression that we already have. In the tenant movement, we see it very clearly with the role the police has in Toronto with us. We never see the police or the community officers coming around to talk to tenants and ask, oh, how is your housing condition? Is there anything we can do to support you? No, the police is the face that comes to evict people, basically. They come with the sheriff is a provincial office, but it's always the Toronto police that comes with them whenever there is resistance to an eviction. So part of our worry about these 150 billions and the military spending and basically pumping up our military is not just that it's going to be used abroad for colonial dreams, but it's also going to be reinforcing the inward looking and the repression on all of our movements. And that's why we think it's a moment to fight together, to get together, to say no to this, and to debunk a lot of the myths of what this military spending will do. Just to give you an idea of what this money could be used for when it comes from the tenant movement. So $150 billion a year. You know how much Trudeau spent in his housing strategy in 10 years? Not enough. $15 billion. In 10 years, 15 billions. Here they're saying we're going to spend 150 in just 1 year to build our military. And of those 15 billions, I also must say, how many did we see in the tenant movement or in our homes? Very little, because most of that went to the big developers, the big landlords that are managing so much more of our lives, that are also, in many cases, supporting the Israeli government, for example, as well. If you look at the Walk for Israel, for example, a lot of the sponsors, the corporate sponsors, are some of the biggest landlords in Canada. So this is all very interconnected. We know we have a need for not just non-profit housing, we have a need for public housing in Canada. We have in Toronto, TCRC. Thank you, and this is just to reinforce Ron's point. So it's a sector that you never really hear politicians defending of all stripes, and this is something we gotta reinforce. Public housing should be accessible for everyone. We gotta expand it. We gotta defend people who are living in TCHC. They're stigmatized by society. TCHC in Toronto alone, in the city of Toronto, the social housing in the city of Toronto has a $15 billion backlog of repairs. Living in TCHC today, in many ways, it's a nightmare for people that should be able to have a stable, safe place to live. It's the last resource we have. It's better than being on the streets, but we need that money to go into places like TCHC to improve the units, to get people living there, making them live in decent conditions. But not just that, we can use the money in so many other ways. Building public housing across the country, $150 billion, I'll take it. It's going to help us rebuild so many of our communities. And it's also going to take power away from these big landlords and developers. Because a lot of the things that are happening now come from government saying, we don't know even how to build a building. I'm not an engineer, but it doesn't seem to me that difficult. But the argument is that even when you hear now Carney talking about the Build Canada Homes program, it is not going to be built by a public corporation. It's not going to be built public housing. It's going to be built by private developers that are going to get yet more subsidies, and that's why they named someone like Ana Bailao to lead that institution. So what we're saying is, let's use this money. Clearly, you could find the money very quickly. Let's use that money, invest it in public housing, but not just in building it. Let's invest it in running the kind of inspections, let's regulate landlords as well with that money. Just to bring you back to another example from the city of Toronto. there's something called rent-safe inspectors. Anybody knows what they are? So if you call 311, that famous number that the city of Toronto gives you for everything when they don't want to deal with you, they just say, call this number. Eventually, if you're a tenant and you're saying, for example, I have mold in my unit, a rent-safe inspector should show up. And they should inspect your unit, and they should either call your landlord, or they should find them, they should force them to fix what you're doing. We have about 2 inspectors per ward in Toronto. So we have 24 wards, 48, 50 inspectors, let's round it up, for probably 5,000 buildings in the city of Toronto alone. So you can imagine that even if these guys want to do their job, let's assume that they do, there is absolutely no capacity. And one of the biggest things is that every level of government always says, we may put some money into infrastructure, we may help you build, but we don't want to finance the operations of this. We don't want to have the permanent workers that are going to be able to do their job in decent working conditions, that are going to be many of them enough to actually inspect all the buildings that we need to inspect, to take all the calls that tenants are making, and to respond to the tenant movement that has been saying, we don't want just the public housing to expand. We also want to really regulate all of the private landlords that are getting so much of our income. We want governments to use the resources that they clearly have to regulate those landlords as well and to support the tenant movement. So in short, $150 billion can get us very, very far for a lot of the things that we need. The movement is already there asking for it. It's just now a matter of pushing and making it clear that we're not going to stand by when the military is expanding outwards, but it's also going to expand inwards into our lives. We got to resist it, and I'm very happy to see so many of you, so many organizations being part of this joint collective resistance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Next, we are going to introduce the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, as well as Voice of Women, whom Tamara Lawrence is representing both these organizations. They're both national feminist peace organizations. Tamara is a member of Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and Women's International League for Peace and Freedom Canada. Tamara is also a PhD candidate at the Bastille School of International Affairs at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo. A round of applause for Tamara, please.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much to the Toronto Association of Peace and Solidarity for hosting this important people's hearing on military spending. I'm Tamara Lawrence. I'm representing the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, VOW, and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom Canada, WILP. Our women's organizations have been working for decades against militarism and military spending, and we have brought our message to Parliament against military spending. Yesterday at the Draw the Line rallies across the country, we had our signs to cut military spending, and we've also brought our message to the Climate Summit. This is a picture of us in Dubai at COP28. This is the Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in December of 2023. Cut military spending, let's fund a care economy, affordable housing, climate action, green jobs, and Indigenous reconciliation. The other message that our women's groups have brought to the climate space is this slide here, is this graphic that we circulate during all of the climate summits, and that's where's the $100 billion for climate finance? This is a commitment that the wealthy Western countries made in 2009 to spend $100 billion to help developing countries with climate mitigation and adaptation. But the wealthy countries for the past 16 years we can't find the money. Where are we going to find the money for the $100 billion? Well, we're saying it's in military spending. In 2015, during the Paris Agreement, the 32 countries of NATO, their combined military spending was $896 billion. Over the past 10 years, the 32 countries of NATO have increased their military spending by more than $200 billion to $1.4 $1 trillion in the past decade. So they have the money for climate finance, but instead they're spending it on militarism. And so this is what we've been raising to the UNFCCC to say, cut military spending, invest in climate finance for developing countries that are bearing the brunt of the climate crisis. This is the latest report from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, their trends on world military expenditures. And you can see that the top 25 countries, most of them are the NATO countries. So the top, of course, is the United States at $997 billion. This was last year. And then you have China, 1/3, about $300 billion. Then Russia at $150 billion. And if you keep looking down the list, you'll find Canada. Canada is ranked 16th highest for military spending. This is in US dollars at $29 billion. And it's NATO that has really driven military spending in Canada. So this is a look at our military spending over the past decade. In 2014, Canada's military spending was $20 billion, and it has increased to over 100% to now $41 billion last year. So this is money that Canada, imagine if we had been spending, another $20 billion a year on social programs and environmental programs. Think about how much better Canada would be now. Instead, we have wasted it on militarism. And at this level of military spending, $41 billion, we are at 1.4% of GDP. So we never met the 2% GDP target. Now, the Parliamentary Budget Officer issued a report in November of 2023 saying if Canada were to increase military spending to the 2% GDP target, it would mean a doubling to $81 billion. And I mean, this is just crazy. And now you've heard that the 2% GDP target is not enough. This is a quote from the NATO Secretary General, his first speech that he gave in Brussels when he became the Secretary General. And I just want to read a part of it. And it says, we, NATO, have enormous advantages. We are 32 allies strong. Together, NATO allies represent half of the world's economic and military might. I can tell you we are going to need a lot more than 2%. I know spending more on defense means spending less on other priorities. And in subsequent speeches and statements, he has actually mentioned pensions are at risk for increasing military spending. So there is a great risk to us, friends, mass immiseration if we increase military spending. But I want you to reflect for a moment about this quote. Think about this, friends. Canada is part of the 32 members of NATO, and there are 194 countries in the UN system. Our 32 countries command 50% of the world economy and 50% of the world's military. This is a mass injustice, a mass disparity. And this is what they are trying to protect. This kind of global economic order that is continuing to enrich the white, wealthy Western countries and keeping the rest of the countries in mass immiseration and underdevelopment. And now, of course, you've heard we're going to increase military spending to 5% of GDP, which will be $150 billion a year. Friends, this is just the start of our campaign. We need to build a national coalition, a national sustained campaign to put pressure on our government to stop this. And we can do it if we work together. We can do it. So I just want to go back and look at the last federal budget that came out. It was entitled Fairness for Every Generation. It was anything but fairness for every generation. It was the exact opposite. The main priority, if you read that federal budget, you will see that the top priority was spending for national defense and the military. And in that federal budget, they have this graphic, and it shows the dramatic rise of military spending over the past 15 years in this country. And of course, it is set to go much, much higher. The other priority in the budget was unwavering support for Ukraine. There was no unwavering support for Palestine in the budget, but it was on Ukraine. Now imagine this, in our last federal budget, the priority was Ukraine. It was mentioned 53 times in the budget, but women, Canadian women, were only mentioned 40 times in the budget. In the past 3 years, our federal government has spent $22 billion to Ukraine to fund the government and to fund its military. In the past 3 years, not $1 has been spent to try to end this war. Why are we spending $22 billion? We wrote to the Office of the Auditor General to say, have you audited this money? And they haven't. This is another campaign that we need to launch, and that is accountability for all of the Canadian public funding that has gone to Ukraine for a war. And we believe it's also a NATO proxy war against Russia, and it's urgent that we end this war. The other thing that happens during the federal budget is that the government releases something called the Statement and Impacts Report on Gender, Diversity, and Inclusion. It's a separate report that comes in parallel with the budget. And they have been doing this in order to implement the gender budget analysis. And in this report, it lists some of the major federal programs, and it does this analysis on gender diversity and inclusion. And so I have just extracted one federal program, and this is to increase weapons production and procurement. So you can see here it says, replacing and acquiring new military capabilities. And if you look at their analysis, it shows the expected benefits for women, nothing. It's all for men. And then if you read the text, they admit that the military is predominantly white men, and that this kind of spending will benefit men. So it's not going to help women and children and youth, etc. The other thing to bring to your attention is that today, we are celebrating International Peace Day. Next week is Gender Equality Week. So Canadian women's groups across the country are going to promote gender equality. And we are seeing great disparity and discrimination for women in the economy. And in particular, the women's groups that is most vulnerable are single mothers. Very high poverty, insecure housing. And so this is one of the campaigns, we are championing is greater women's equality, trying to end the gender wage gap, things like this. Another area that we see this discrimination between men and women in the economy is also, of course, in our budget. And if you look at the Public Accounts of Canada, in Volume 2, you will see Table 2, which is a great overview of all of the federal revenues that come in and all of the federal expenses. And these are our major departmental spending. And so if you look on this slide here, you will see that the top federal department for spending, of course, is the military, is national defense at about $33 billion. And then if you scroll down, you will see that the Department for Women, Gender Equality, and Youth, their budget is only $71 million, a fraction of what the military spending is in Canada. That is the low priority that the federal government has for children and youth in this country. So little, so low. Now you think to yourself, okay, well, what is our military doing with all of this funding? There is a misperception in this country that our military is doing peacekeeping. We haven't been doing peacekeeping seriously in over 30 years. What we are, this is the latest statistics from the UN Peacekeeping Office, and it shows that Canada is currently ranked 71 with only 32 peacekeepers on UN peace support operations. 32 out of a Canadian Armed Forces of 85,000 personnel, 32. And the United States, the most well-funded military on the planet, has only 22 peacekeepers on UN peace support operations. What are we doing then? What Canada is doing with US and NATO is war fighting all of the planet. Think about what we've been doing in the past 30 years, destroying Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and now Ukraine. That is what our Canadian military is doing, and that is why we need to cut military spending as well. And there has been no accountability for this as well. We have never paid any reparations for the death and destruction we caused in Afghanistan, in Yugoslavia, in Libya, and what we've been doing with this complicity in the genocide, supporting Israel in their genocide against the Palestinian people. So our women's organizations have been calling for Canada out of NATO and for the alliance to be abolished. At the table, Canada out of NATO, Canada out of NATO. At the table that we have in the back, we have buttons that say Canada out of NATO. We have a parliamentary petition for you to sign for Canada to be out of NATO. We also have 2 other letters for you to sign. One is to sanction Israel, and the other one is to cut military spending. And we also have lots of buttons. Defund the military, fund a green care economy. That is our message. Defund the military, fund a green care economy. And we have lots of handouts for you as well. The other handout, and we don't have time, one more minute. We don't have time right now to go over it. I gave you just one snapshot, and this is an excerpt of the last public audit account so that you can see the revenues and the expenses, the information that I showed. And finally, friends, I just want to bring this last resource to your attention. On September 9th, at the beginning of this month, the UN Secretary General came out with this excellent report, The Security We Need, Rebalancing Military Spending for a Sustainable and Peaceful Future. It's an excellent report with excellent graphics that you can use. I encourage you to read this report, bring it to the attention of your members of parliament, use the social media, the graphics on your social media platforms. It's really excellent. And it was the UN General Assembly members, all of the non-NATO countries, the 162 countries that are outside of NATO, called for this report because they are worried about rising military spending. The entire world is with us. They want military spending cut, and they want investments in peace and sustainable development. Let's work with them together, friends, and make this happen and a reality in Canada. Canada out of NATO, cut military spending. Canada out of NATO, cut military spending.
Now, for our last speaker before the break, I want to introduce the Toronto and York Region Labour Council, representing over 200,000 workers from diverse sectors across the Toronto region for over 150 years. The Labour Council has been committed to fighting for economic, social, racial, and climate justice. The council works tirelessly to create a fair and equitable future for all. Jack Koppel is an organizer for the Toronto and York Region Labour Council. Jack joined the labour movement in 2018 when he participated in a successful worker-led unionization drive at the hotel where he worked. He later served on the bargaining committee and as the property's first shop steward. Put your hands together for Jack, please.
Thanks. So as Jared said, my name is Jack Koppel. I'm happy to bring greetings to you all on behalf of Toronto and York Region Labour Council. We represent over 220,000 members across the region, and as Jared said, for 150 years, we've represented working people in the struggle for economic, racial, social, and climate justice. I'm proud to say that we view peace and international solidarity as such a key element to those struggles that we've actually got it enshrined in our very charter. So I'm grateful for the invitation from TAPS and for the opportunity to speak to you all about the need for a peace budget here in Canada for working people and our sisters, brothers, and comrades everywhere else in the world. I do need to just say one thing first, however. Bit of an unusual situation for our council. We give deputations all the time. City Hall, Queen's Park. Sometimes we have to shout them into the closed doors of a workshop from a picket line. I don't think, at least in my time, we've ever had to advocate for a reduction in a line item on a government budget. So this is a bit of uncharted territory for us, so you'll have to bear with me here. I'll start my deputation by saying something which should be no surprise to any of you here, which is that living conditions for working people in Canada are bad and getting worse. Living standards for the working class have declined steadily since the turn of the century, but precipitously since the beginning of the COVID pandemic. The sharpest and most often talked about feature of the decline in the recent period has been the cost of living crisis hitting so many working people right now. Prices are up, most cases way up, and wages have simply not kept pace. That's meant effectively working class in Canada has gotten much, much poorer. Recently, there's been attempts by major political parties in the mainstream media to obfuscate this reality. Have you heard the good news? They'll say. Wages have risen. Since 2023, we've heard about the catch-up that's happened as wage gains have outpaced inflation for the first time since 2020. The only problem is, and this is the footnote of the presentations that they give as reviewed by the Parliamentary Budget Office, almost all of those wage gains that have occurred in the top 10% of income earners, and really actually, it's only occurred in the top 1%. So that means that in most cases, people have seen a complete stagnation in their wages, and for everyone who's a 60% income earner or below, they've seen an absolute decline since 2019. So I'm looking around, and given I don't see anyone with the last name Weston in here, it's safe to say that all other earners part that I just mentioned, that applies to everyone here. But I'm sure I don't have to be the one to tell you that. So what's that meant? How hard has life become for the working class in Canada? There's some key figures I want to provide to you now that I think give an indication of the picture. So since 2022, 12% of all credit cards ever in circulation in Canada have been open. Total credit card debt since 2022 has increased by 25% to the highest number on record. Credit card delinquencies, meaning consumers who are unable to pay even their minimum balance for 90 days or longer, have increased 27%. Mortgage delinquencies have risen by nearly 300%, and delinquency rates in Toronto are now as high as they were during the 2008 financial crisis. Food bank usage has more than doubled. Homelessness has increased 30%. Unemployment in Toronto has risen by 40%. I could go on and on and on. The question facing us now, of course, is how did we get here? There's lots of tough talk that you hear on the media about broader economic headwinds and the impacts of excessive immigration. But I suspect everyone here knows those are just smokescreens to obfuscate the truth. The truth is, we just experienced one of the most spectacular upward transfers of wealth in human history. The profit-seeking price rises of the period after the beginning of the pandemic are the direct cause for the decline in living standards for working people in Canada. Their price gouging and profiteering has created a crisis for working people here and abroad. But now, instead of addressing the problems, major political parties are proposing we intensify that crisis through huge cuts to our social spending, 15% cuts across the board. That's the directive that's been given to federal agencies in Canada by the Prime Minister. Estimated job losses stemming from these cuts to the federal public service alone is estimated to be 60,000. That's on top of the 10,000 already terminated in just 2024. Further job losses will follow as transfers to the provincial and municipal governments are halted, and the cuts trickle down to services there. And it won't be just those directly employed in the public service who are going to feel these cuts either. Service levels for those government agencies, which I suspect we all use, are going to decline. So that's tax filings, passport renewals, border crossings, employment insurance claims, pension claims, and more are all going to substantially suffer. Alex MacDonald from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives put it quite clearly when he said, "What do you do when you lose your job? You go to file an employment insurance claim and no one ever answers the phone." Trickle-down impacts of these cuts will also affect services in healthcare, education, and municipalities, as half of the cuts that the government's imposing are to transfer payments. So these cuts themselves represent yet another massive upward transfer of wealth, as they, alongside a spate of regressive tax cuts, shift an even greater burden onto working people. There is, of course, at least one line item on the government's budget which won't see a cut. That's why we're all here today. That's the military. As we all know, we've been seeing phenomenal increase to their budget, up to an annual spend of $150 billion. It's a big number. I'm not a mathematician. I struggle to kind of wrap my head around big numbers. I wanted to try to put that sum into perspective. So a recent statement passed by our Labor Council in August explores it in greater detail. We found that if that money was spent elsewhere, we could instead build 43 new hospitals in the first year, conduct a backlog of repairs on every single school in the country, and build 1,000 new schools in the second year, and build over 300,000 units of social housing in the third year, all while maintaining service levels for every single government program where they are right now today. It's difficult to wrap your head around exactly how transformative this level of government investment could be if it was instead turned to supporting the needs of working people in this country. In addition to everything I just mentioned earlier, I'd like to add another example which is worth considering. Due to the ongoing trade war with the United States, who, as other speakers have mentioned, are the ones pushing for this increase in the first place, tens of thousands of workers in the auto and steel sectors have lost their jobs. I come from Hamilton. Job losses in Hamilton are really stacking up. The main industry there in many places is still steel. So that means my brothers and sisters and comrades in the United Steelworkers are losing their jobs right now. In Ontario alone, since January, there have been 38,000 layoffs in manufacturing caused by slowdowns and permanent closures. A majority of these layoffs have been centered in steel and auto manufacture. So based on the value, I did some looking into this to see if the government's really doing everything it can to address this. Based on the value of the machinery and parts, so the factories themselves, and assuming we pay workers a $40 an hour minimum wage, the government could, in a single year, purchase each and every single plant in the province, including those which have not closed, like Stelco, and pay the wages and benefits for every single laid-off worker and transforming it into a nationalized steel industry. So that was a lot of numbers. Let me just make that clear. In 1 year, instead of spending $150 billion on our military, we could purchase and employ every single worker at Stelco, DeFasco, National Steel Car, Stellantis in Windsor, GM in Oshawa and Ingersoll, and many, many more for less than what we plan to spend on the military. A government-owned steel and auto sector would employ tens of thousands and support the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands more and leave us with money to spare. Now, advocates of military spending will tell you, but wait! Spending this money on the military will create jobs too. And it's a nice line from them. But it creates substantially fewer jobs than spending on the public service or the public sector. For instance, according to UN estimates, every $1 billion spent on the military creates approximately 11,200 jobs. That same amount of money could instead create 26,700 jobs in education, 16,800 in clean energy, and 17,200 in healthcare for the same dollars. Moreover, the end of the product of most military expenses is weapons production. In the best case scenario, after building one of those weapons, it sits on a shelf and collects dust, doesn't do anything. We know often what the worst case scenario looks like. Whereas in the case of public spending, every dollar spent has an economic multiplier effect, creating more jobs and services in the communities it's spent in. This effect would only be intensified in the case of a government-owned steel and auto sector because of the high value-added nature of the industry. And I want to tell you really directly, I find it hard to believe, having spoken with many of these people at union meetings as they've been laid off recently, to find that a worker building a light armored vehicle from Bombardier gives a damn about whether or not they're building a school bus instead, I think they'd go ahead and prefer it. So let's speak directly for a second where this funding is going to as well. An increase in Canada's contributions to adventurism and genocide abroad. Just this past week, the United Nations confirmed what all of us in this room have known to be true for some time. Israel is committing a genocide against the Palestinian people. And that genocide continues to be supported by the Canadian states through an ongoing arms trade. In November of 2023, our Labour Council spoke out against the attacks on the Palestinian people, and we have been vocal since to Canada's complicity in the genocide. Increasing military spending in Canada to propagate peace internationally is like trying to douse a raging fire by pouring gasoline on it. It's not just fiscally irresponsible, it is completely immoral and an abdication of our responsibilities to international law. Taken all together, it's clear that Mr. Carney's being inaccurate. He's been telling Canadians that they should be preparing for an austerity budget. But the reality is the Canadian people should be preparing for a war budget, because that's really the budget that this government is about to table. War on the working class in Canada, war on the people of Palestine, war on working people all over the world. This is the shameful budget that Mr. Carney is bringing forward. The good news is working people all over the country are speaking out against these injustices. From picket lines to Palestine solidarity protests, our Labour Council has marched with them, and many of you in this room, with tens of thousands across the region to struggle for economic justice and peace. More working people went out on strike in 2023 than in any other year since 1984. That trend has continued in 2024 and 2025, even though they'd like to tell you otherwise. In the face of government repression and intervention in strikes, we're also seeing heroic defiances, like from CUPE Air Canada workers who refused to abandon their right to strike and stayed out on the picket lines. All over this country, working people are standing together to beat back the profiteering of the bosses and the warmongers to win a better future for all. To put it quite simply, war is over if you want it. That's why we're proud to join you all for the call on the government to abandon the path of austerity and war it is slouching towards and invest instead in a program of peace and prosperity. Invest in jobs for the workers in Windsor and Hamilton. Invest in jobs for nurses and electricians. Invest in a sustainable climate for the generations that come after us. And I'll end just by saying solidarity to the workers at CUPW, solidarity with striking college workers at OPSU, solidarity with all the United Steelworkers laid off, and solidarity with the people of Palestine. Solidarity to you all. Thank you very much.
Our first speaker for the second round is going to be the Canadian Federation of Students Ontario. Representing more than 350,000 student members, the Canadian Federation of Students Ontario is the voice of post-secondary education in the province and across the country. The Federation represents domestic and international students at the college, undergraduate, and graduate levels, including full-time and part-time students, through their students' union from different colleges and universities across Ontario. And I want to welcome the presenters, Cyrielle and Omar. Cyrielle is the chairperson of the CFS Ontario. They've consistently advocated for the amplification of Black and Francophone voices and for the recognition of student unions' autonomy. Omar is the national executive representative of the CFS Ontario. Omar started his advocacy efforts by organizing student-led protests against the University of Toronto administration's complicity in the ongoing apartheid and genocide in Palestine. Give it up for our presenters here.
Hi everyone. I hope that folks are doing well. Yes, we're going to save the introduction since we already did that just now. Again, we're really happy to be here and really talk about military spending, but specifically in the context of education and when it comes to student perspectives. So the purpose of our little blurb here today is to be able to bring the student perspective from students, from student unions, from our organization to highlight how that impacts ultimately the way students go to school and the way students essentially just live. Ultimately, we know that every single dollar that is spent into military is a dollar taken away from education, is a dollar taken away from public services. And so we're going to use this as an opportunity to be able to draw those lines and those connections between the two. And yeah, so that's going to be that. All right, so first and foremost, I'll start off by saying that students ultimately have had a long history of organizing for change and making a difference on multiple levels. Students from the onset of the creation of the Federation, even just before the Federation created, were able to make those connections between their education, the government decisions, and impact internationally. Students in so-called Canada are not separated from the larger fight for liberation, and again, students were able to make those connections from the get-go. What we are seeing students do and what students have consistently done is hold the government accountable for the decisions that they have made that ultimately impact the material conditions that we find ourselves in, right? So what you see here on the slide is just examples of different movements that students have been for. And so students have consistently organized against the Vietnam War, apartheid in South Africa, military invasion in Iraq and Afghanistan in 2003, CANSEC weapons expositions, and the genocide in Palestine. All right, so now, with that being said, that was essentially just a little bit about the role of the student movement and students more specifically, but now it's important to be rooted in the current conditions that we find ourselves in order to understand where does the military kind of like play a place in that. When it comes to the education sector more broadly, students are essentially going to school within a system that is chronically underfunded, right? The post-secondary education sector has been chronically underfunded for decades at the expense, of students' lives, experiences, whatever the case may be. We are experiencing expensive tuition, fees, and lackluster OSAP. What we have seen over the past couple years is the government has made a lot of cuts when it comes to the OSAP program. They have cut over $1 billion since 2019, and honestly, that's a very shameful thing to do. What we're seeing on our campuses is that very key student services and resources are being defunded and downsized, right? And you'll hear us draw this connection very often, is that every single time that we are seeing services being cut, programs being cut, and certain structures being downsized and defunded, that comes at the expense of security being increased, military being increased. And so all of these things don't happen in isolation, they happen at the same time. We're also seeing international students being scapegoated for a cost of living crisis that, quite frankly, the government has manufactured at this point in time. I've mentioned the program cuts that we're seeing, and the program cuts that we're seeing are paired with essentially layoffs from staff and faculty across the province. We're seeing administration repression, right? Like we've mentioned that it isn't new that students are consistently holding our governments accountable for the material conditions that we live in, but unfortunately, as a result of that, students are being repressed. Their voices are being suppressed, and ultimately that comes with union busting and unfair working conditions, right? Ultimately, in the work that we do, as much as we advocate for students and represent student needs, we are in solidarity with labor unions and labor groups, whatever the case may be, and we know that an impact on the working conditions of workers is ultimately an impact on the learning conditions of students. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the state of education a little bit more broadly and talk specifically about the underfunding piece. So I did start talking a little bit about it, but I wanted to give some clear comparisons so that folks are able to paint the picture in your heads in terms of what we're seeing in terms of underfunding. So folks, again, will have come to understand that education right now is in a dire state, right? There's really no other way to put it. We are in a crisis, and that's really what it is right now. Post-secondary education right now is receiving less funding than it did in the 1980s, right? Between 1983 and 84, post-secondary education received a 0.49% of GDP from the federal government, but by the time that we got to 2021 and 2022, that was decreased to 0.19%. Ultimately, what we're seeing the government do is make a lot of decisions without student consultation, and a prime example of that is the Ontario Blue Ribbon Panel. So this was essentially a government attempt to try to, again, make decisions on behalf of students without student consultation. And as a result of this panel, there was a recommendation to invest $2.5 million into the education sector. But even with that recommendation, the government still fell short. They ended up investing only $1.3 million. And even when you take a look at the grand scheme of things, the $2.5 million that was recommended isn't even enough to address the crisis that we find ourselves in. So all around, we're seeing governments attempt, again, to try to fix or try to help the education sector, but they're not doing that. And I think I want to stress out the fact that this is a system working exactly as designed. This isn't the government making a mistake. This isn't a government saying, oopsie daisy, like this was a mistake on our end. This is an intentional decision that the government has made in order to push forth an anti-education agenda. And to continue on with the state of education, we talk about tuition fees. Tuition fees plays a really important part in terms of going to school and being able to access school, because ultimately tuition fees are a barrier. They represent a financial barrier for folks being able to go to school. And unfortunately, what we have seen the government do is that the more and more that they scale back from funding from education, the more they rely on tuition fees to actually fund the education sector. What that means is that now the burden has fallen on us as students, as parents, as community organizers, whatever the case may be, to essentially fill in the gaps that the government has created in terms of funding to education. Right now, fees are roughly $8,000 for domestic students at minimum, and so that means that they go up, as well as $40,000 for international students. So for international students, we're seeing tuition fees be 3 to 5 times more than domestic tuition fees, and that is not a great thing at all. What we see tuition fees contribute to is that at this point in time, tuition fees contribute at least 40% to the revenue of Ontario's universities. And when you take a look at colleges, on the other hand, they rely heavily on international student tuition fees, and they ultimately account for 68% of tuition revenue. That, keep that, outrage, right? When we think about that, it's really insane and silly to think about, because at the end of the day, international students only represent 20% of full-time students, yet they make up 68% of the funding for education, right? And at the end of the day, that's not what we're here for, right? We don't accept the government putting that burden on us, and unfortunately those conditions have shaped itself so that it is so, but we're not going to stand for that. Shame.
So currently we know that military spending is federal and education is provincial. But yet, despite that, the federal government still is required to actually send certain amounts of money to the provincial government, and that is specifically meant for education. And these are called social transfers, right? Since the provincial government doesn't actually want to have dedicated funding for post-secondary education, these transfers aren't even enough to fund the system in place. And going hand in hand with the current rising cost of living crisis that we are currently experiencing, this shows that students are currently experiencing many different angles of this cost of living crisis, whether it is due to rent, whether it's due to groceries, whether it is due to their tuition. Our students are currently facing such increased barriers in terms of accessing a manageable life, and the government continues to take more and more money out of education and put it into things like, for example, the military, right? We are seeing an increase in military spending, and it is significant, right? And when we see more money being put into things like the military, that means there's money being taken out of somewhere else. So the growing military budget is in tangent with the continuous declining funding for education. Students continuously fill in the gaps for the lack of government assistance. When we look at student unions continuously hold campaigns, continuously hold services, and continuously hold events where they are actually not only bringing attention to the lack of actual support from the government and from administrations, but they're also actually providing these essential life-saving services like a food center. Why do student unions need to be providing food centers? It's because we are currently witnessing a manufactured cost of living crisis that is currently putting many people, students especially, in situations of not even food insecurity, where people are there are certain areas where students are experiencing food deserts, right? Where the food is not only accessible financially, but any food that is accessible is lacking in nutrition, right? We are seeing the federal government talk about how this new budget will be an austerity budget, and that Canada will want to meet NATO's 2% GDP target this year, which is around 50 billion, but we also know very openly they've talked about wanting to spend up to 5 billion, which is over 150 billion, 5%, sorry, which is over 150 billion dollars from our tax money, right? Which at the end of the day, this doesn't help any of us. More money is leaving universities and is going straight in. More money is actually entering universities only for specifically like military research, which is directly affecting our quality of education. We are seeing mass amounts of program cuts. We are seeing faculty and staff being laid off. We are seeing entire campuses being shut down due to the lack of funding in our education. And the government, instead of actually tackling these issues, is proposing either band-aid solutions or is trying to trick people into thinking that their solutions are solutions when actually they're just making things a lot harder for students. We'll be talking more specifically about these direct attacks, things like Bill 33, which is a provincial bill. And both our provincial and federal government want to open up critical resource minerals for the military. We've heard about Bill C5, we've heard about Bill 5. These are directly attacking, directly attacking indigenous people's sovereignty, where it is trying to push priority for the economy. Once again, they are putting profit over a priority over a sake of people. In 2023 and 2024, they ended up budgeting $7.2 billion for post-secondary education. Then it was revised to and then $5 million were taken away from it, right? But despite that revision, over $100 million was actually not even spent in there. And so we continue to see the less money they continue to spend in education and in these services, they will now use that as an excuse to say we don't even have to fund it we don't have to fund this amount, we can take even more money out because we haven't even spent that amount, so we don't need to be spending even more. And almost $2 billion was left unused in 2023 and 2024 in their contingency plan, right? We're also seeing how Ontario currently has the lowest per student funding in the country, despite us having the most amount of students, whether it's international or domestic. We're also seeing the federal government social transfers for post-secondary education have continuously staggered and have been less and less every single year, with a 39% drop. And we are also seeing that this amount of money that they are taking away from education actually and being put into the military, this amount of money that they're being put into the military, if they were to put even $16 billion out of that $150 billion that they want to spend, we could see free education across the entire country. But instead, we know that the government is more concerned in prioritizing profits. They are more concerned in prioritizing war, apartheid, genocide, increasing famine across the world, just to make sure that they can continue making money out of the suffering of us as people and people all across the world. And we also see, and just like that, I mentioned Bill 5 and Bill C5. The government continues to put profit over people, and this is shown directly by these bills, where they are attacking directly the indigenous people's rights to their sovereignty. We are in continuous solidarity as students with the indigenous organizing groups, because we know at the end of the day, when we look at indigenous people's access to education, we see that it is something that the government also doesn't prioritize. When we see indigenous education, when indigenous people actually are able to access education, we see that there aren't any resources being allowed. And when I say resources, I'm not just speaking specifically about like financial, but also in terms of the education system, there is no like indigenous history, more often than not, isn't even being prioritized or isn't even being provided sometimes isn't even being provided at all. So it's incredibly important that we as students continue to recognize that as settlers as well, we have to continue actually advocating against this attempt of erasure of the indigenous people on this land, right? We're seeing we know that there's a long history of land theft and extraction. Settler colonialist violence is an ongoing system, and imperialism and corporate greed is what continues to actually fund and feed our current education system, because we know that they continue to feed off of us as students and off of people for the sake of continuously making like a profit. I keep repeating myself in the sense of profit over people, but it's really important to make sure that we continuously recognize that this isn't something that is new, but this is a system that has been put in place for a very long time, and it continues to exist, and the government and the people in the state as a whole continues to actually benefit from this system.
All right, so now we're going to talk about the cost of underfunding education. Like so far, we've kind of laid a little bit of the groundwork. We talked a little bit about what our current material conditions are as students, and ultimately, what does military spending look like in that case. More explicitly, when we see increased military spending, that comes at the expense of education that is debt-free and decent per-student funding, right? We've highlighted that ultimately, Ontario has one of the lowest per-student funding when it comes to education, and that is a very shameful thing considering the wealth of the province in itself. And when we mean what we mean when we say education that is debt-free, the reality that we're seeing across the board is that ultimately students are graduating with a looming debt sentence. At the end of the day, what is made available to students in terms of resources are more loans than there are grants, and ultimately year after year, students are racking up a high amount of debt and are unfortunately graduating with that. I talked a little bit about a reliable OSAP system. Ultimately, to put it quite frankly, the OSAP system as we know it is broken. Even though it was inherently, let's say, created to address the fact that education is really expensive, ultimately what we're seeing with OSAP is, again, cuts being made and changes in eligibility requirements, right? And so more and more, like year after year, we are seeing less and less students being able to even access OSAP. But then at the end of the day, let's think about it. Why does OSAP even exist to begin with? If this is a government initiative, the government itself is already recognizing the fact that education is too expensive. If they didn't even believe that, would OSAP even be a thing to begin with? So let's think about that, right? Increasing military spending comes also at the expense of free tuition, right? Omar was just mentioning how only $16 billion on the first year and then $10 billion annually would be needed in order to have free and accessible education for all. But look at how much money is already being put into the military, right? So if we're even able to take just a fraction of it, we're able to see already that financial barrier being removed for folks to be able to access education. Increased military spending also comes at the expense of consent of where fees are going, and this is a really important thing, right? Because students are paying thousands of dollars in tuition fees, but where's that money going ultimately? We're seeing that money going into weapons and arms manufacture, but as students, did we give our consent for our money to be used that way, right? We're seeing the stability of Francophone and Northern students being compromised. Ultimately, we mentioned that we're CFS Ontario, so we're around the province and we have membership across the province. Already, Francophone and Northern students have precarious conditions in comparison to some of our member locals in southern of the province. And what we see is that an impact on southern locals more specifically is actually going to be increased or tripled or whatever the case may be when it comes to Francophone and Northern communities. When we increase money in military spending, it also comes at the expense of stable housing conditions and safer housing conditions, as well as food insecurity. Like Omar was talking to us a little bit about food insecurity and the existence of food centers on our campuses that are run by students because governments leave intentional gaps. We were just talking about the free and informed prior consent of Indigenous communities. A lot of military projects that are put into place come at the expense of Indigenous sovereignty. What we're seeing is land extraction, land theft that Omar just talked to us about. And overall, increased military spending just comes at the expense of consistent access to public services and community-based services. Ultimately, when it comes to the public sector, we're seeing it in its entirety being compromised by increasing expenditures in the military as well as intergenerational wealth. All right, so now I'm going to talk about Bill 33. On to the next slide. Yeah, sorry. Sounds good. Ultimately, when it comes to Bill 33, this is essentially sweeping legislation that we're seeing from the government. And ultimately, if folks have had the opportunity to sign the petition that we have actually in the back at our table, please do so. It's an opportunity for you to sign on to our campaign, Hands Off Our Education, which is essentially against the bill. What we're seeing the government do is increase control on the entirety of the education sector, again, at the expense of autonomy and democratic processes. And ultimately, we don't stand for that. But let's talk a little bit about how we can reimagine our future.
So to recap, we've already discussed about how the government is not only already spending too much in military, but now they are pledging that they're going to be spending even more, $150 billion that could be going into our public services, into our education. That is a life-saving amount of money for our entire society. And the fact that the government continues to actually spend that money into things that, once again, doesn't help us, and then they try to turn around and say that they want to look for peaceful solutions to things. We know at the end of the day, if we don't get justice, then they won't get peace, because we know at the end of the day, it's important to make sure that there's no such thing as peace if people are starving. There's no such thing as peace if people are houseless. And there's no such thing as peace if people can't have access to fair access to education, right? So it's incredibly important that we continue to advocate against this unnecessary military spending, against unnecessary overreach and oversight with Bill 33, against this unnecessary attempt to control Indigenous people's rights to their sovereignty with Bill 5 and Bill C5, and continue standing in solidarity to make sure that we as people can actually see this money being spent in a way that actually benefits us. And so very briefly, I'm going to be talking about some of our campaigns. Cyril mentioned our Hands Off Education campaign. This is our newest campaign, which is a derivation of our Fight the Fees campaign, because we know tuition is incredibly expensive and the quality of education is very, very low. And so it's really important to make sure that we continue to actually show students that there is a better option, that there is a better, that there is a way to actually get a free and accessible education, right? Bill 33, as Cyril mentioned, is a way for the government to give themselves unnecessary oversight and overreach over our education. And that's not fair, especially when they don't know what's actually happening on our campuses, and especially when they're trying to push the blame of the current cost of living crisis on international students, and especially when they're blaming the high cost of tuition on services, when we know the real reason is because of the lack of funding in our education. We have our Students Against War campaign, which is very simply Students Against War. We don't want our money going into weapons and arm manufacturers. We don't want our money going into military as a whole. And we also have our Banks Off Campus campaign, because we know at the end of the day, the 5 major banks in Canada continuously actually are massive spenders in the military corporation, the military industrial corporations. Yeah. And so it's really important to make sure that we continue to actually get these banks off of our campus, because not only are they continuously investing in weapons and war, but they also provide loans to students that are incredibly predatory and incredibly dangerous for students. And we're already at risk of entering leaving school with an insane amount of debt. And so with these loans as well, that's just going to be adding on to it.
All right, and to wrap up, ultimately when it comes to people power, that is the most important thing to keep in mind when we are fighting against the material conditions that we find ourselves in, and fighting against the different systems of oppression. Again, like I mentioned, we have a petition going around, and so I think that Andrew might be going around to collect some more signatures so that we're able to build that people power in the context of Bill 33. Ultimately, students are demanding that education be treated as a public good. It's really not that serious. Ultimately, in building people power, what's important to us is that we're building cross-movement solidarity with labor unions, different grassroots organizers, because there are more of us than there are government officials and people that we need to be holding accountable. At the end of the day, we know that our collective power can make government priorities shift. And that's the most important thing. And we're going to wrap up there.
TTC Riders is a grassroots democratic organization of transit riders advocating for accessible, frequent, and dignified public transit across all neighborhoods in Toronto. Their vision includes prioritizing transit improvements that help people with the least equal access to transit, treating public transit as a climate solution. More ridership means less vehicles on the road, less GHG, less congestion, and transit as a right and public good. Philip has been a volunteer with TTC Riders since 2023, having been spurred to action after the derailment and early decommissioning of the Line 3 SRT. Rest in peace. He has been working as a TTC Riders staff this past summer and has also been a member of Acorn Canada since last year. Alex is a new team member of TTC Riders. In his spare time, he enjoys cycling, learning about transit, and advocating for peace. Welcome, Philip and Alex.
So the Toronto Census Metropolitan Area, or GTA, has over 6 million people in 2021, which is about 44% of Ontario's total population at that time, and it contributes to about 20% of Canada's GDP. The region's home to a wide variety of national and global industries, including finance, manufacturing, information and communication technologies, and biomedical and health technologies. About a third of these people in the region commute to work within the city of Toronto. Each kilometer of metro moves significantly more people than a highway can. The morning peak period of our southbound Line 1 subway carries the equivalent of about 26 lanes of highway. If this Line 1 did not exist, the equivalent of 8 to 9 additional Gardiner Expressways, or DVPs, would be required to provide the same capacity into downtown Toronto. Transit is also an economic multiplier. Riders are not just commuters to and from work and school, but are connected to grocery stores, cafes, doctors' offices, etc. The TTC estimates that its cost to benefit ratio is about 1 to 7, meaning every $1 invested in TTC services and infrastructure generates $7 in economic and social benefits. And its current 10-year capital budget is expected to add $12.6 billion in additional GDP, $29.7 million in overall economic activity, as well as over 180,000 jobs.
So the TTC, despite more than carrying its own weight, is one of the least subsidized transit systems in North America. So prior to the 90s, the funding model kind of worked with the provincial government providing 50% of funding for municipal transit operations budgets across the province. In 1997, Premier Harris cut this funding, removing $718 million from the budgets of municipalities' transit systems in Ontario. Since then, the top two revenue sources for the TTC has been primarily from you, the rider, fare revenue, and from the city, so property taxes. Between 1996 until COVID, the situation was that you'd have generally about 2/3 of funding coming consistently from you, the rider. Since COVID, we're right now at about 38%, so just under 40% is covered consistently by fare revenue. And we're not expecting to get to pre-COVID levels of ridership until at least 2028. You see there's a kind of small graphic explaining this there. This is alongside the fact that we're facing a $4.3 billion state of good repair backlog. There's an operating budget gap of $936 million, both of these for the next decade. And it's not the TTC that's facing the situation right now. Every transit system in the Americas is facing a similar kind of fiscal cliff situation. Every transit system in Canada is, as of 2025, have operating budget gaps, and some of them are already turning to fare hikes to trying to offset this. Ottawa has already done this, Hamilton, Vancouver. Without stable investment, we're very much at risk of what I would refer to as like a transit death spiral. So this is kind of vicious cycle where service gets worse, people don't use the service, and then ironically the service continues to get worse because you're missing that fare revenue to fill in the portion of operating budget that relies on that. I'm happy here kind of a graphic of the Greater Cleveland Regional Transit Authority, just because it shows like how bad it can get. For an American example, ridership kind of bottomed out in the 80s due to disinvestment. The service got worse, and now it's like less than 1/3 of what it used to be as of the 2019 graphic.
So how will increased austerity affect transit riders? The John Tory government in 2023 introduced new TTC service and crowding standards, with the latter increasing from 35 to 45 people per bus at peak periods when accounting for standing passengers, meaning fewer and more crowded buses. Other suggested cuts included having subway service as low as every 6 to 10 minutes, For Wheel-Trans users, the current voluntary family of services cuts would mean no more door-to-door service, meaning riders will have to use conventional buses, streetcars, or subways for various parts of their trips, some of which are not even elevator accessible at all. In terms of transit poverty, austerity will mean fare hikes and service cuts, which will harm low-income and far-flung suburban riders the most, like riders in the eastern Malvern and in West Jane and Finch. Entire bus routes are cut and bus route off-peak frequency is reduced. This will limit riders' access to employment opportunities or even be within range of cheap groceries, as our previous panelists were talking about the food deserts. In terms of failing infrastructure, the reduced speed zones that have been appearing on Line 1 and 2 since early 2024 are a direct result of years of disinvestment in regular track maintenance. Line 3 was set to be decommissioned in 2023 as a direct consequence of disinvestment, resulting in the 2023 derailment due to poor track quality. The 1995 Russell Hill disaster killed 3 people and injured 30. It was partly because of this incident that the TTC invested in implementing automatic train control on all of Line 1. Not updating this technology on Line 2 means a tragedy like this could happen again. Investment in high-quality rapid transit leads to reduced car congestion by preventing a shift of commuters to cars and encouraging ridership. For example, between the opening of Line 4 in 2002 to 2019, Shepherd Young Station has seen a platform usage increase of 64%. And according to the Yonge Street North Transportation Master Plan, the focus area just north of Finch Subway Station has seen a decrease in share of car trips by 11% between 2006 and 2016. More vehicles on the roads, of course, means more exposure to fine particulate matter such as tire dust and greenhouse gases, which can contribute to asthma and respiratory disease. If more people shift to public transit, air quality improves. The increased presence of paved surfaces associated with more investment in car-centered infrastructure and suburban sprawl will contribute to watershed hardening. With that, the soil will be less able to absorb water-drain rainfall, contributing to flooding. The biggest reason why Hurricane Hazel of 1954 was so devastating to Toronto was not due to the hurricane itself, but due to flooding that occurred after. With the increasingly erratic weather and rainfall we have been seeing due to climate change, another extratropical cyclone of this nature near Toronto has the potential to be far more disastrous.
So I'm going to be talking about our hypothetical budget and hypothetical alternative spending. So as per CNN conference, I forget how many weeks ago, Carney is saying that he wants to raise the military budget by 5% of Canada's GDP. So he's saying this is $150 billion per year by 2035. And then he's also saying that by the end of this fiscal year, so April 2026, a 2% increase, which if we're assuming that the Canada GDP for 2025, I don't know which quarter this is about 3.16 trillion. That's just a bit above 60 billion per year. So I'm going to talk about like how much the federal government already spends on our municipalities' public transit. So this primarily is something called the Canada Public Transit Fund. So this is 30 billion per year, on average about 3 billion per year. The streams are not super relevant. I'll just mention that Toronto is set to receive in 2026 1.2 billion. So just to give an image of how little this is, the annual investment of 3 billion, that's like the 2% raise that Connie wants to increase, that's 21 times bigger than the annual Canada Public Transit Fund in current investment. And then for the full 150 billion per year that he wants to end up paying per year by 2035, that's 50 times bigger. This is, the Canada Public Transit Fund is 5% of this 2-year increase alone, it's just 5%. So one of the asks that TTC Riders was asking for the federal government this coming budget is to double the Canada Public Transit Fund from 30 billion over 10 years to 60 billion. So this is kind of the breakdown, if anybody wants to look at it afterwards. We're assuming that Toronto is going to have 11.2 billion over the next 10 years. I subtracted what we already spent for 55 new subway trains over Line 2, and then 48 billion for the rest of Canada. So Alex is going to talk about what we can do with that 11.2 billion.
We could certainly work on eliminating the $4.3 billion state of good repair backlog for 2025 to 2034. This backlog has contributed to the aforementioned slow zones due to track replacement. As of last week alone, there were 14 across lines 1 and lines 2. Federal funding means that large amounts of track work no longer need to happen all at once, as the old tracks are gradually replaced and maintenance becomes routine rather than last minute. This means a fast subway for riders. The state of good repair backlog also consists of other regular maintenance activities such as replacement of the subway's traction power systems, other infrastructure renewal, regular bus replacements, and continuing to expand the replacement electric bus fleet and its associated charging infrastructure, meaning the TTC can keep up with changing service demands with enough vehicles. While this doesn't sound glamorous, investment into the TTC's state of good repair keeps public transit safe and reliable in the long term, ensuring riders can get to work and school on time. It could also fund the entirety of the Waterfront East LRT and most of the Eglinton East LRT. So the Waterfront East LRT will serve over 100,000 residents in the developing East Waterfront and Portlands area. For residents, that the early delivery of this LRT is key to reducing early car adoption and reducing downtown congestion as people choose rapid transit instead. It will also boost the waterfront economy by connecting to 50,000 jobs. The Eglinton East LRT will bring an estimated 81,000 people within walking distance of the corridor by 2041, as well as connecting the historically underserved area of Malvern to rapid transit.
So with the remaining $48 billion for the next decade, Canada could cover 12.5% of regular operating costs for both Toronto and Montreal. What this means is that you could also potentially offset the cost of combined cost of what fare would usually be paid by teenagers and by elderly folks over 65, I think, for TTC's fare system. The remaining billion cover a similar policy in Montreal, as it's their regular operating budget is about half of the TTC's annually. And there are precedents, obviously, for free transit, but these are particularly investments targeted for age demographic. The UK already has their English National Concessionary Travel Scheme for elderly and disabled riders. Bucharest, Romania offers free transit for all pensioners and students under the age of 18 on surface transit. And Romania-wide, there's a 90% subsidization rate for all post-secondary students. We don't have to be my point with this is that we don't have to be as small or as rich a country as Luxembourg, where there's entirely free transit, in order to subsidize the transit for people who might need it the most. Second, big ticket item. For the low cost of $12 billion, I think there could be high-speed rail between Toronto and Montreal. So the Quebec City Windsor corridor holds half of Canada's population, but by rail service is notoriously terrible on this because it's running on the same tracks as cargo freight. Canada's the only G7 country without high-speed rail. Yeah, shameful. 540 kilometers between Toronto to Montreal as a line could serve over 12.2 million people, with trains going up to 300 kilometers per hour on these dedicated tracks. This is faster than the new Amtrak next-gen Acela trains that they just bought just now. Those only go 257 kilometers per hour. So between Montreal to Toronto, we could cut a 5-hour trip by via train to just 3. By 2045, we could have increased passenger ridership by 6.7 million. That's removing 7 million tons of CO2 from people who usually drive in this corridor. So Trudeau's Alto high-speed line estimate is pegged at like $80 to $120 billion. This is more than double what the European Court of Auditors would expect to be for the average for EU estimates for high-speed rail. Plus the multiple older studies and the Monk School study that I took this $12 billion number from. Multiple studies have been done since 1995 estimate significantly lower estimates for what you could build the whole corridor for than this current $80 billion cost. And a lot of these low estimates are coming from the fact that we're using a P3 model to build a lot of these projects. This is the same model that's behind the Crosstown, the same model we use to do Ottawa's Confederation line, the same model we use to do bigger projects like Muskrat Falls in Muskrat Falls Dam in Newfoundland Labrador. A 6-year, $4 billion design phase for this HSR is insane. Like that is how long the Monk policy paper that I used to borrow this estimate from is estimating that it could take to build this corridor between Toronto and Montreal. What we need to do is we need to invest in public works and keep public-private partners on a tight leash for this, because other countries are spending significantly less on transit to build higher order transit. So yeah, that's just what we can do for 2%. 2%, not 5, 2%. I want to cover really quickly the struggle for transit and the struggle for peace, how there's kind of some intersectional connections between the two. So Canada already does spend a good amount of security spending in other countries to kind of exert influence over other sovereign nations. So a classic example, I guess, is the Congo situation, where we don't formally use this as a big source of like coltan, cobalt, lithium, all the stuff that goes into both EVs and also like electric mass transit that uses batteries. But we do get it through Rwanda, and it's something that's subsidizing our green transition, and it's not something that's justifiable with the kind of horrific labor conditions that you get this is mined from, including with child labor. Of other countries, I wanted to kind of break down some other situations. Generally, it's related to the presence of Canadian mining assets. We have a ton in South America, we have a ton in Africa. Haiti, with its coup in 2004, Canada continues to fund the Haitian National Police to the tune of $2.4 million, 2024 to 5. I have a couple other examples, but I don't think I have time to go through it. I include an example closer to home of the Wet'suwet'en situation from 2022, where the Ottawa spent an estimated $25 million on RCMP raids of this unceded land in order to build the Coastal GasLink pipeline. There's also, when you look at the breakdown of spending for Toronto Police Services versus the TTC, they tend to basically compete with each other. They're some of the top two expenses. Last year we had a doubling of the previous increase from the year before in police spending. And the cycle I want to kind of explain here is that you'll have increased military spending. We're going to be inevitably drawn into foreign overseas conflicts. This means there's going to be more protests by peace and environmental activists. This means there's going to be ramped up police budget to suppress those protests and dissent. This means, subsequently, at the local level, there's going to be less funding for municipal transit. Finally, regular Canadians are not going to benefit from this. It's going to be large military contractors. So in 2024, Bombardier, CAE, and MDA Space submitted a report basically lobbying the federal government to raise, November 2024, submitted a paper basically to lobby the federal government to raise GDP to 3% of spending for NATO. Recently, CEO Eric Martel of Bombardier said he's eagerly looking forward to expand jet production over the next decade. They have a subsidiary based in Kansas called Bombardier Defense. They already do manufacture jets that either indirectly end up in defense use situations or directly sold into. So my point is that a lot of the resources for defense spending and for transit are the same, the material resources and the labor resources. So every mechanical engineer that could be building tanks could have been building locomotives. Every plate of aluminum that could be going into a fighter jet, this could be going instead to a aging streetcar. Every construction worker, every data scientist, every land surveyor, electrician, systems engineer, welder, ton of steel, rubber gasket, lithium battery, copper wire, everything. Every stage of this, the expansion of the war machine, it comes at the expense of our transit. So the next time you're waiting 40 minutes at a stop for a bus that was supposed to go 20 minutes ago, and you catch the tail end sound of a Bombardier Global 7500 zipping at Mach 0.9 speed above your head, I want you to remember where your tax dollars are going.
Now, the Ontario Health Coalition is the largest and broadest public interest group on healthcare in the province, representing more than 750,000 Ontarians in its network of more than 500 member organizations and more than 50 local chapters. It is a nonprofit, nonpartisan activist network and policy advocacy organization whose primary goal is to protect and improve our public care system.
So I'll just jump right in with two stories of healthcare privatization, which I'm sure you've all heard about to some extent in Ontario. So, of course, not across our own province here and in provinces and territories across the country, where the private clinics have been allowed to creep in, they're all routinely charging patients hundreds, thousands of dollars for medically necessary surgeries, medically necessary diagnostics, healthcare. And that's unlawful under the Canada Health Act. It's illegal under provincial legislation as well. And so in the past year or so, over 200 patients have reached out to us because they were charged in private clinics. And these patients are often seniors, they're often on fixed incomes. We've heard from people who've had to use up their retirement savings to pay for surgeries. We've even heard from somebody who was retired and had to go back to work to pay for his surgery. And yeah, we got that. And so on the screen here, this woman, her name is Maureen Monroe. She's 85, she is from London, and we heard about her story. She came to us, and she was told that she had to pay $7,000 for cataract surgery. She lives on a fixed income, and what she was told was that she was going to lose her vision because she was going to get macular degeneration, and she needed the surgery urgently. She had to take out a loan to pay for her surgery. And her late husband had passed away from macular degeneration, and of course she was very scared that she was going to lose her vision. And so she was also told that she had to wait, I think 2 years on a wait list to get the surgery, which is not true. With a lot of the patients we talk with, they will say that, oh, the private clinic said I have to wait 1 year, 2 years, even more. And that's just not true. You can look up the wait list for surgeries on the Ontario Health website, and in the vast majority of cases, they are nowhere near that long. And so she was really shocked and angry when we spoke with her. She said she was, taken for a ride when she went to this private clinic, and to this day, she is still trying to catch up for the cost of the surgery. And another patient who's shared their story with us, she is an 80-year-old retired teacher from Ottawa, and she was told that she had to pay $11,000 for cataract surgery, and it made her so anxious that her doctor actually had to monitor her for high blood pressure. And so thankfully, she actually reached out to the Ottawa Health Coalition, and they were able to help her and explain to her that, this is a medically necessary surgery. It's covered by OHIP. It should not come at a cost to you. But had she not been able to get this information, had she not been able to, get this counseling, then she would have been on hook for $11,000, and that is the highest cost we have heard for cataract surgery to date. And these costs are only increasing over time. Sala will get into it later, but the private clinics are not a new problem in Ontario nor in Canada. And so the fact that seniors are being unlawfully and illegally charged for medically necessary healthcare it's incredibly wrong. It's happening at an unprecedented case, and it's outrageous. It should never happen in Canada. And when we won public Medicare, public healthcare, this is the exact type of thing that we won to prevent. It all goes against the values of compassion and equity that we won public healthcare on. And so we really won it. So we would receive care based on our need, not our ability to pay. The whole point is that the judge and the janitor are in the same ward. And of course, when we won the Canada Health Act in 1984, we won it so that when we are sick, when we are dying, when we are at our most vulnerable, we are not burdened with the need to pay thousands of dollars for healthcare. And yet, Maureen and the retired teacher from Ottawa, they were charged, or quoted, in 2022 and 2024, respectively. And so, to understand what has changed since we won public Medicare to now, and also why these private clinics have proliferated so much, leading to increased costs to us, we need to look back at the effects of the most progressive budget in our modern history. And it's a budget that fundamentally changed the course of our country. It's the federal austerity budget of 1995. And I'll hand it to Salah to go over that.
All right, so it's time for a little history lesson. So you'll see three folks on screen there. On the left, that's Paul Martin, who was the finance minister when the 1995 budget was tabled, Jean Chrétien, who was the prime minister, and our current prime minister, Mark Carney. So, so the 1995 budget, why was it so regressive? Let me run through the numbers. 45,000 public servants lost their jobs. Unemployment insurance, there were cuts to unemployment insurance. Couple those together, that means people were losing their jobs and losing the social safety net that was supposed to exist to help those people who lose their jobs. The federal government stopped funding for affordable housing for the first time in 50 years. The budget slashed transfers to provinces for health, education, and other social services by $7 billion, and they eliminated the Canada Assistance Plan. All of this paved the way to draconian cuts to welfare from the provinces. This led to an epidemic of homelessness, forced work for welfare programs, and other issues I'll talk about very shortly. At the same time, crown corporations were privatized. So some of you may be familiar with Petro-Canada. It was created as a result of the 1973 oil crisis when prices hiked for oil. What did the government do at that time? They decided we need to control our domestic supply, we need to be insulated against price shocks, so they created Petro-Canada. What happens in 1995? It gets privatized, so we no longer have control over our domestic supply. When it came to Canada Health and Social Transfers, this combined funding for health, education, and social services into one block fund, and federal transfers were cut by 40%. These cuts, combined with provincial cuts, led to the expansion of private clinics, which continue to have an impact in our healthcare system to this day, and have contributed to the issue of hallway medicine, which you may have heard of in the news. So in 2004, Paul Martin, again, that fellow on the left over there, he was now Prime Minister, and he tried to redress some of the damage that was caused to healthcare in that 1995 budget. He announced federal healthcare investments to offset the huge cuts with a health accord that introduced a 6% escalator to the Canada Health transfers, although at that point privatization had already gained a foothold. It also increased federal share of health funding, not at the 50-50 level it was, but around the 20% mark. The exact amount varies by province, which while it was an improvement to healthcare funding, the 1995 budget paved the way for the erosion of public healthcare. The reality of the budget is low and modest income individuals and households were the ones most affected by these cuts, which have had lasting effects that we still feel to this day. We can trace the beginnings of private clinics, hallway medicine, rampant homelessness, unaffordable post-secondary education, and most of the current housing crisis to this budget. The reasons we're here today is the Carney government, again, that fellow on the left over here. It sounds like what they're proposing for public services, and specifically the cuts to public services, may be similarly devastating as it was in the 1995 budget. So let's look a little more at the consequences of federal austerity. So the beginnings of private clinics. In response to the 1995 budget, as I mentioned, the provinces responded on their own as well with cuts. So we're talking about cuts to hospitals, we're talking about rationalizing of services in communities and regions, and we're talking about the moving of services out of hospitals. The provinces with the most aggressive drives for privatization, which were Alberta and Ontario, they at the same time pursued tax cuts for those that were the wealthiest. You combine those two things, that meant that the impacts of the federal government's cuts were most felt by those who were low income. Starting in the 1990s, the seeds of a new industry of private healthcare businesses were planted, with the number and type expanding over the years. In Alberta, the first for-profit MRI clinic opened in 1993. In Ontario, a for-profit cancer treatment center opened in 2001, followed by 8 more for-profit MRI CT clinics. In Quebec, the first orthopedic surgeon opted out of the public insurance plan to open their own for-profit surgical center in 2001. In 2004, LASIK MD, which is a for-profit eye care clinic you may have heard of, that's when they laid the foundations for their expansion. Since the early 2000s, as you can hear from these examples, a private for-profit surgical diagnostic industry has emerged for the first time across Canada and has been making significant inroads. These for-profit surgical centers only serve the profitable patients. Thus, those who are the quickest to care for, the easiest to care for, the least expensive to care for. Because what's the name of the game for them? Just to maximize profits. They don't care about the people. They charge higher fees to the public system, so our OHIP system here in Ontario, the private clinics charge more than the hospitals do for the exact same services. So they cost us more, and studies show they provide more dangerous care as well. For-profit clinics serve to reduce capacity in our public system and increase health inequity by increasing the barriers to public health care. And Alana will talk more about the inequity issue.
Yeah, so in Ontario and across Canada, income inequality was actually improving from the post-World War II period up until 1980, and it may come as no surprise to all of you that since then, salaries and wages dished out by the private market, our employers, have been more and more inequitable. So if we take a look at this graph here, I understand the text is a bit small, but it's showing the average family income of each decile of Ontario residents. So it's based on families. These are in real dollars as well, so it's been adjusted. And so evidently, as you can see with that orange line at the top, the highest income earners have increased their incomes. And at the very top, like, they just launched themselves into the stratosphere. And the middle incomes are relatively stagnant, as you can see here. There's a bit of an increase in the middle and upper middle classes there. What is less visible is that the lower middle class and below have actually lost income. Not that these classes had much to start with, but this really means that the executive and higher income managerial class, these are the people who at least have more control over their incomes, and they have essentially taken all the income and wealth of a generation, and they have not passed it on proportionally to any of the middle class, any of the working class people, of course. It's basically means that anybody born after 1983 has not seen a society where wealth inequality is actually getting better. And so I explain this just to lay the groundwork for this next chart. And it just explains how the tax and transfer system actually helps mitigate all this. It's obviously a huge creator of economic equality, by mitigating the inequality that's dished out by the private market. And so these transfers include things like EI, your tax credits, social assistance, child benefits, and so on. But on top of this, like on top of the tax and transfers, we have public services like public healthcare, public education, public transit, and so on. And it's important to note that, like in this graph, those public services are not included. It really only addresses the value of like the transfers, EI, child benefits that I mentioned earlier. And so, just from a quick look, you can see that basically everybody up to the top 3 deciles benefits on a net whole from the tax and transfer system. And the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, they did a study in 2009, and they calculated the financial benefit of these public programs and services that we receive in Canada. And they found that the average single Canadian receives $17,000 in tax-funded public services each year. That was almost equivalent to like a full-time income at minimum wage. And in fact, a middle-income household would receive benefits by, I think, $40,000, $41,000 on average at the time. And so if we adjust that to like our current dollars, like the value right now, that would be $24,000 for each individual and nearly $60,000 for the average middle-class household. And so that's just kind of how our public services, our taxes and transfers, including healthcare, education, transit, and so on, they mitigate a lot of the income inequality that is, as we all know, it's only increasing at this point. It was only, I think, like July this year that StatsCan, they issued a report saying that we have record-breaking income inequality right now. And of course, in this context, an austerity budget would be absolutely devastating. And similarly, we have cut healthcare funding to the bone in Ontario. In this province, we already fund our public healthcare and public hospitals at the lowest rate per person in the entire country. We have the fewest number of hospital beds per 1,000 people in the entire country as well. And so clearly our public healthcare system cannot afford any more cuts, and neither can we as Ontarians. And so we really do want the Carney government to do well, but it is to our peril that the federal government dismantles or cuts the tax and transfer system and the public services that mitigate the inequality that comes from the private market. And it's also worth noting that even the Financial Accountability Office of Ontario, they recently did raise a red flag about the widening inequality. And they stated in a recent report that research by the OECD and the IMF has concluded that higher income inequality inhibits a jurisdiction's economic growth. It does so by lowering human capital investment, discouraging initiative and innovation, and lowering potential productivity. I know that's all in, the terms that people use in those reports, but basically there's no path to economic growth, the path to economic growth that they keep on talking about when the government cuts the programs that redistribute the benefits of that growth to everybody else.
So the proposed budget by Prime Minister Carney must focus on the values that matter most to Canadians. Our cherished public Medicare system, which allows us to receive care not based on how much we can pay, but based on need, must be protected, and we must ensure we can afford care no matter how much money we have. We must learn the lessons from that 1995 budget that I provided a history lesson on earlier, and to combat the rise in healthcare privatization and prevent the damage caused by mass public service cuts and privatization. In the context of the largest income disparity in Canada that we've ever seen, which causes suffering and hardship, as Alana has mentioned, it's unjust and it's a threat to economic growth. We must all raise our voices and insist in no uncertain terms that these values matter. It must mean we stand up for those values that make us who we are. Equity, supporting one another to live to our capacity, a belief in public services, a just society, diversity that brings a wealth of culture and texture to our social fabric and is not a threat, that we stand for peace, not militarism, democracy, not dictatorship, and compassion, not greed. Thank you.
Finally, the Toronto Association for Peace and Solidarity will give a deputation as well. And I will welcome TAP's co-chair, Amanda Murphy. And I think I'm going to sit down at the table too. So we're both co-chairs at the table.
Shortest bio of the day. So the Toronto Association for Peace and Solidarity has been thinking about putting on a people's hearings on military spending for some time. And we wanted to ask the simple question, what would ordinary people and working class people do with the money that is currently being promised to the Department of National Defense, or honestly more accurately, US weapons and arms manufacturers, if government spending was prioritized differently? And truth be told, we began seriously thinking about putting on an event like this to address Canadian military spending when there was a renewed drive to reach NATO's 2% of GDP target. Now, 2% of GDP for military spending in the name of individual and collective security sounded utterly nonsensical to us at the time. After all, and as many presenters have touched on today, we have been and continue to be living through a cost of living crisis, thanks to inflation, the skyrocketing cost of food, fuel, housing, resulting in a dramatic drop in real wages and take-home pay. All the while, education and healthcare continued to be chronically underfunded and the public worse for it. So we were forced to ask whose security was being considered here exactly. And when it was announced in June of this year that NATO member states were now committing 5% of GDP by 2035, and that's $150 billion annually based on GDP figures for this year, the program for this event more or less wrote itself. The task before us was to connect as many labor, housing, social justice, and community organizations as possible to hear how this spending shift will affect their members and those they advocate for. And the hope was to highlight how interconnected these struggles are with military spending, with the struggle for peace, and as well with the international situation. After all, and it's now plain to see after all the insightful presentations given today, it is not possible to invest $150 billion in deeply antisocial spending without having a profoundly negative impact on desperately needed social services that we all rely on. These things are inextricably linked. That link, which has brought us all together today, is maybe the only silver lining in an otherwise horrendous political decision. And there is basis of unity here that we can harvest to force our demands on whichever party is holding office and say no to $150 billion to ratchet up the drive to war and yes to social spending and people's needs. This spending increase is simply unconscionable given what working people are facing on the domestic front, but also in the context of increasing international tensions and the drive to war, to which this spending directly contributes. So, what exactly is the international situation? And why isn't the soon-to-be largest expenditure on the federal budget determined domestically? Turning on the news or scrolling through social media feeds, we are bombarded with looming threats from beyond the border. Canadian sovereignty and our way of life, whatever that means exactly is usually left undisclosed, is in jeopardy, so we're told. Specifically, we hear over and over and over again ad nauseum about the existential twin threats of Russia and China. We are told Russia, who, just for the record, has been coming for us since the turn of the last century, but presumably got lost along the way, is about to strike us from the north. China, with its approximately 750 military bases over 80 countries. Those are the US numbers. China, with its singular foreign military base, is poised to take over the world if we were to glean anything from corporate media and, importantly, increasingly public broadcasting. But whatever one's assessment of these countries, and there are no shortage of opinions on that front, and however real or imagined the threat of confrontation with them is, it is of fundamental importance that we reflect on the ways the Canadian state and its NATO allies are contributing to tensions and how they have responded to this existential threat. Economically, Canada and its NATO allies have unilaterally unleashed an economic war against Russia and China. Rather than diplomacy, elected officials have opted for unilateral sanctions and tariffs, often targeting products that would be beneficial to Canadians. Chinese affordable EVs is just one example. And rather than engaging in diplomacy to find political solutions, we lay down economic penalties like a global police force. Militarily, no secret for this crowd, NATO member states, of which there are 32, have responded by agreeing to set aside 5% of GDP for new military hardware, ammunition, and weapons of mass destruction, because let's not forget that NATO is a nuclear power. The GDP estimates for NATO states last year was $54 trillion. This means NATO's new 5% target would see $2.7 trillion spent on military expenditures. So the spending from just 32 countries would equal the entire world's current military spending. In what universe does this sound like a sensible plan for collective security? On what planet does this sound like a model for peace? And in whose head does this conjure thoughts of prosperity for working people the world over? Reading between the lines, it becomes clear that this spending is less about our collective security, those of us in the room today, here in the room today, and more about the economic security narrowly defined for the few. Profits for arms manufacturers and energy corporations, and the protection of trade routes. Palestine warrants special mention here, as Canada's shameful support of genocide in Gaza can in part be explained in these terms. The development of Canadian foreign policy towards Israel and Palestine generally corresponds with the significant growth of Canada's economic interests in the Middle East and North African region. This is particularly noticeable since the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement, CIFTA, was last updated in 2018. In the context of the deal's updates, Canada's trade with Israel has increased sharply to over $2 billion annually. In discussing CIFTA, the Canadian government singles out the military industry. Arms exports to Israel have skyrocketed from 7 million in 2014 to nearly 28 million in 2022. And this continues to this day despite an arms embargo receiving lip service from the Liberal government. And the new report recently has been released that smashes that and debunks that, which can be found on armsembargonow.ca. So I encourage you to check that out. There's a regional dimension to Canada's foreign policy towards Israel and Palestine. The bulk of its dealings in the Middle East and North Africa are aimed at facilitating and protecting Canadian foreign investment. Global Affairs identifies the region as an economic priority for Canada, noting that trade with the area is growing at a pace that exceeds Canada's overall global trade growth. Of course, Canada is not the only big capitalist power with economic interests in the region. The US, Britain, European Union countries, all of whom are NATO members, are also expanding their control over trade routes and land resources, particularly oil and gas, which converge in the North African regions and the Middle East. This constant drive by Canada and its NATO allies to divide and redivide the world's territory helps explain why the United States has nearly 30 military bases spread across the region, including in Egypt, Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and on and on and on. It also helps explain the participation to various extents of Canada, Britain, and European countries in the US-led military overthrow of the Libyan government in 2011, and the ongoing proxy war on Syria and the successful regime change campaign there, which began in 2011. Regional instability and changing zones of influence have created an urgent need for a stable base of operations, not for us, of course. And Israel, with a well-developed, Western-oriented economy, with a long-standing political interdependency with the West, fits that bill. As foreign powers become increasingly frantic about shoring up their power and protecting the zones of influence, they are more and more willing to support increasingly aggressive and brutal, genocidal Israeli policies, as long as they are a stepping stone to stability. And stability means, of course, protection, expansion of corporate interests in the region. Canada's support for Israel, along with its military expenditures, as they are now determined by NATO, is inseparably linked to regional influence and corporate investment. This is why the Toronto Association for Peace and Solidarity puts strong emphasis on Canada's NATO membership in our political work. This is directly where and how our military expenditures are determined and where our foreign policy is shaped. This spending is not determined by careful debate in the House of Commons that takes into consideration the genuine needs of working people domestically and ideally also internationally, but rather through NATO's Parliamentary Assembly, which acts as a forum to ensure that governments implement policies that reflect its priorities, and since its creation, the policies of the United States. It also bears mention here that NATO spending targets, and this may come as a surprise to you, like this 5% of GDP, $150 billion for the military, and all I got was this lousy childcare wait list. It bears mentioning here that NATO spending targets like this new 5% of GDP is not linked to a specific budget or strategy. It's simply a commitment to spend. Can you imagine taking your car for a repair, or in my case, your bike in for a repair, and the mechanic says that'll be $10 million? And when you ask what it's for and what was the problem in the first place, one of them, it's ridiculous. Canada's NATO membership links our country to a militaristic alliance directed by the United States and its interests, making it virtually impossible to deviate from foreign policy decisions made in Washington. The Toronto Association for Peace and Solidarity demands that Canada adopt an independent foreign policy based on peace, disarmament, solidarity, not war and aggression. A foreign policy based on mutual respect that rejects unjust, unilateral economic warfare. The necessary prerequisite for such an independent foreign policy is that Canada withdraw from NATO and other such military pacts like NORAD. So how will we pay for all this? And who will be fronting the bill? An important consideration when trying to find $150 billion, I hope everyone here agrees, which for the record represents a 333% funding increase from 2024, when military spending was around $34 billion. Not a bad raise. The Carney government is promoting its military spending as a way to produce jobs. But a study just released by Brown University in Rhode Island demonstrates that military spending is inefficient for job creation. I think Jack from the Labor Council touched on this a little bit earlier on as well. The study, an update from a report from 2023, shows that military spending, including both government defense spending and various private military industries, produces an average of 5 jobs per $1 million in spending, including both direct jobs and jobs in supply chains. By contrast, 13 jobs are created for every 1 million jobs in education spending. That's nearly 3 times as many jobs. Healthcare, 84% more. Infrastructure, clean energy, 24 to 64% more. The Carney government has repeatedly informed the press that these targets will be made by making a series of tough decisions, one of which was to slash 15% from almost all Canadian ministries by 2029. Does anyone here work for Border Securities or the RCMP? Too bad. Can you name the 2 ministries not included in these cuts? I won't say them again. I want to make something absolutely clear because there's some confusion about this. These massive cuts are the direct result of our military increase. These tough decisions that are coming are going to be made by us in this room today. How to pay for rent, how to pay the mortgage, childcare considerations, whether or not to pay for medications or whether or not to pursue higher education, while public services continue to see massive cuts. What we should be doing is making the easy decisions, as we've heard so much about today. $150 billion could build 430,000 publicly owned and delivered social housing units every single year. That's more than 2 million truly affordable units in the space of 5 years. And that's exactly what we need to face this housing crisis. The amount that could be used to build around 3,600 new schools or 60 new hospitals each year, or to create in the area of 1.7 million full-time jobs at $40 an hour. Instead, NATO and our federal government want to put that money in new military hardware, ammunitions, and weapons of mass destruction to fuel more aggression, more global insecurity, more war, more destruction. The Toronto Association for Peace and Solidarity calls for the prohibition of all military weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear arms, ending of arms races and militarization of economies, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, the opposition of unjust unilateral economic warfare waged against any state, negotiations and non-use of force in settlement of disputes, and the rights of nations to choose their own path of development. As mentioned at the top, there is a basis of unity here. To pay for this war budget, we will see massive cuts that will affect every section of Canadian life. But when life gives you war and austerity, we can make lemonade. We can harvest this unity and say, let's cut military spending and fund social and environmental needs because the people demand a bigger piece of the pie. Yeah.